Hello and welcome to the third lesson in this lecture series. Today we will be talking about some very important aspect of the language of cinema. But before we do that, let us take a quick recap as to what we talked about in the last lesson. So in the last lesson we talked about mise en scène, the various components that come under mise en scène and their uses and how they are used to advance a story or to create meaning in any filmic text. We also talked about the various cinematic tools that are used or that are at the dispense of a director or a cinematographer to be able to tell a story or to create a narrative. As for today's lesson, in today's lesson we will talk about editing. It's a very important part, of course, it's an integral part of the cinematic language. So what we will be doing is that we will be tracing the history of editing. So we will start right from the beginning and we will trace it right till the present day. We will also talk about the various developments in the editing process through the years and how editing has come to be to what it is today. Now, after you are done with this lesson, what should you be able to achieve? So what are the various objectives of this particular lesson? The first one is that you should be able to understand the concept and the importance of editing for any film. You should be able to trace the history of editing. So how has it developed over the course of almost more than 100 years. And you'll also be able to recognize the various technological advancements that have taken place and have also influenced cinema in their wake. So let's start. Now, first and foremost, what is editing? Let's not think about editing as related to cinema, but generally, what do you think that editing means? We associate it with words like correcting or rearranging or sometimes modifying something, an existing material to make it presentable to an audience. So if you're preparing a lecture, I'm a professor, I'm preparing a lecture, I have to be able to edit out whatever is important and keep in whatever is important and edit out whatever is not required. Now, if we try to think of editing with regards to cinema, it's very simple. It's just the arrangement of different shots to be able to construct a story that is comprehensible, that can be easily understood by the audience. So you arrange different shots together, and how do you arrange them? That is what editing is. Now, for editing to come into cinema, there are certain precursors. So these precursors have existed in the form of scene changes in theatre or flashbacks in terms of novels. So whenever you see flashbacks and flash forwards in the case of a theatre or in the case of a novel, or when you see one scene change from the other, that's a kind of an edit. So that's the exact same thing that we see in the films today, in the cinema today, whenever a cut is placed to tell you the story in a better way. That is what editing is. Now, how is it that editing was introduced into the world of cinema? Because before cinema actually started, before cinema as we know it today came into being, there was also this starting point for everything. Right. So we will be talking about the history of cinema a little later, but just to give you a brief idea, because we need to understand how editing came into existence. The first kind of films that were shot were single reel films. So they were generally shot from a very static camera angle. The shot size wouldn't change, and it basically shot something that was going on. So it captured an event, an actuality, and hence the name. So the entire thing was shot in one continuous take. So it's almost like if I'm speaking to you, or let's give you a better example, if I were to be writing something in a diary. So the camera would just be there, it would shoot me for whatever duration the reel lasts, which was typically a minute or something, and that would be it. That was the first film. These were the kind of films that were made. So now when the actualities were made, they were not really able to showcase them for the public. So it was the Lumiere brothers who actually, with the invention of the cinematographs, were able to bring actualities or moving images to be able to be shown to a huge public. And the first ever public screening of a motion picture happened in the year 1895 in Paris. Now, amongst the spectators was a very important person, a person who is actually important for the world of editing, and that was Georges Méliès. Now, when he watched these projections of live cinema, of live action, of motion pictures on the screen, he was very, very impressed and he wanted it for himself. Now, so he started experimenting. He also acquired, a camera that could work for him. He was a magician, he was a showman. So he wanted to be able to show whatever he could in the form of a live performance. He wanted to be, able to project it like he had seen in the public screening in 1895. So he started experimenting. He also started working with his, with his shows and trying to capture them. In 1896, a very interesting event happened. Rather an accident, because George Méliès accidentally discovered a very important cut which was known as the jump cut. Now, what was happening was that he was shooting, across his street where there were a couple of men that were walking, and there was also a vehicle that was going across. Now, what had happened was that while he was shooting, the camera sort of froze. It stopped recording. So, and the action of course continued playing on, but when he was able to bring the camera back to the recording position, he recorded, and then when he came back with that material, what he actually saw was that on screen what had happened was that the vehicle that was there in a shot was suddenly changed into a hearse. So this is what was really interesting to him, and that is where this jump cut came into existence. So visually it was like a horse or a vehicle changing into a hearse, and that is something that really caught his attention, and that is how he started using this kind of an edit. But this edit was also a very in-cam edit. So it would mean that you are shooting something, you stop recording, you bring something else in the picture, and that takes over. So he used this jump cut a lot in his short films. Now, in all these actuality films, in all these these edited films, in these in-cam edited films, all the shots that were shot were the tableau style. So tableau style is something like theatre. So because the precursor to cinema was theatre, so therefore what the makers of the films, they thought was that the camera should be at one position like a spectator would experience any play. So you would not move into close-ups, or you would not move the camera because you would be fixed in the position. So that was the same style that the filmmakers were following. And this editing, as I already mentioned, was done in the camera, so known as your in-cam editing. So nothing was being cut and pasted together till that time. Let us now discuss the beginning of editing in cinema. How is it that it all began? Now, although I say beginning, but early on the filmmakers were very, very skeptical of the idea of editing, because to them this idea of editing was actually contradictory to reality as experienced by the people. So for example, if you and I were talking to each other at the moment, if you are looking at me from this direction, you would be looking at me you would be looking at me front on. You would obviously not be still standing there and look at me from a different angle. So this is what the filmmakers had a problem with, because they thought that if editing was introduced into cinema, it will actually be quite contradictory and people might not take it very well. But of course there were some gradual changes, there were some minor experiments that were conducted in the production process that actually led up to the process of editing, and to the filmmakers actually warming up to the idea of editing in cinema. Because we are talking of editing, it's important for us to understand how is it, or where is it that it all began. So which is why we will now talk about the Americans and their contribution to editing in cinema. And one of the first names that is very important that you should know about is Edwin S. Porter. Now, Edwin S. Porter, he was the first filmmaker ever to splice more than 2 rolls of film together. Now, as I had said earlier on, generally the films were made with 1 roll of film. The actualities, they were 1 roll of film. So Edwin S. Porter was the first person who actually spliced, and by splice I mean to put together, to cut 2 different rolls and to put them together. So he was the first person to actually do this, that he combined 2 different film rolls to tell a story, to narrate an event. A very important film, a very important film by him is Life of a Fireman in the year 1903. This particular film is also considered the first linear narrative film because, and it was actually a combination of actuality film and a little bit of action, because what had happened in the film was that he wanted to show that what happens to a fireman, how is it that they deal with various situations. So this particular film was actually two things. It was a combination of stock footage. So stock footage is material that has been already shot. So the stock footage was of an actual rescue, and then he had also shot material with actors where he asked them to enact certain parts. So this particular film was the first that actually started off with this idea of editing. What it did, so as I said earlier, it showed two different camera positions of the same action. So there is one scene in the film where the fireman is stepping into the room. So this particular shot was shot. Shot, it was taken from two different camera positions, one from the outside of the building and one from the inside, and then a cut was placed to match the action. So this actually became the basis for the match on action tool that we use so much today in the world of editing. We'll also be talking about match on action in the next PPT, but so that we can understand it a little more better. The second film that is very important to understand editing is The Great Train Robbery, which also came out in the year 1903. What it did was that it pushed the envelope a little bit more. It pushed the entire narrative style. What it did was that it used more than one setting. So it has various locations that the event was shot in, and it also did something very, very interesting. Edwins Porter ended the film with a mid shot. A mid shot is something of the kind of a shot that would take the person from the head till somewhere around the waist, somewhere above the waist. So this was one of the first films. This was the first film, in fact, to actually use the mid shot. And if you observe the cinema today, if you observe the television today, you'll also realize that it's the mid shot that is the most prevalent, that is used the most in different kind of settings, because it's said to be the shot that is very comfortable for us, and it also gives a lot of detail. So in this film, in The Great Train Robbery, there were two different actions also that were taking place at the same time, that there was another scene. So, and this became the basis for parallel editing, wherein two different actions are taking place, but they're taking place at the same time. So it's almost like if I'm delivering this lecture at the moment, and in another room there is a teacher that's actually taking a class with a in a different room. So if you were to show both the classes at the same time, you show some of me and show some of the other room, this is what is parallel cutting. So this particular film, it actually used parallel cutting or parallel editing for the first time. Another very important thing that this particular film did was that it established the shot as the basic language of cinema, because up till then the filmmakers had understood the sequence to be the basic style or the basic of a cinema. But with this particular film, the filmmakers understood that it is the shot that is the most basic tool in cinema making. Let's move on to another very important person, D.W. Griffith, who was later on regarded as the father of narrative cinema, because what he did, what the kind of changes he introduced, the kind of experiments he did with the cinema is, are the ones that we actually see today. So the kind of editing that we are used to today with the kind of films we watch, a lot of it has actually been developed by this person almost singularly. So what he did was that he came up with a majority of editing conventions that we are using today, and the idea was to tell a smooth story, a continuous story, right? So a film by him in the year 1908, which is called The Greaser's Gauntlet, it used varying shot sizes. So this time the camera has stopped being fixed at one position and the camera was moving closer or further away from the subjects. He also used a lot of tools like the cross cutting and the 180-degree rule. We'll be talking about these rules in the next slide, so you'll in the next lesson, so you'll become a little more clearer about what these are. But please remember that it is him that actually started off with these conventions. How did he come up with these conventions, or how were these conventions sort of formed, is that he was constantly experimenting. And also whenever there were any problems on the set, so through creative problem solving, all these different kind of conventions of editing were actually set up. He also did another important thing, which is that he pioneered the use of the close-up and also the other rules as we know them today. But not just by him, there were also, because he did so much of experimentations, so there were his peers who sort of started doing the same thing. And so all these rules that we talk of today, the editing rules, were actually the ones that were developed by D.W. Griffith and his peers. A very important film that we have to talk about is The Birth of Nation. It was a 1940 film by D.W. Griffith, and it is said to be the first blockbuster ever. So what happened in this film is that it was the first feature-length film. You know, it ran pretty long, for almost 3 hours, and it was really applauded for its narrative style. Now when we say narrative style, it means that how is it that the story is told. So there were multiple locations, there was a huge cast of people who were working in the film, and there was a lot of action that was taking place. So yes, that way it was really applauded for its narrative style, but it was also condemned because it had some very strong racist overtones. But regardless of that, the film still remains a very important milestone in cinema, because it started off or it laid the basis for the narrative style of cinema that we are so used to today. In the film, Griffith showcased a lot of the editing tricks and a lot of his editing techniques. Later on, of course, as we know, these techniques evolved into the editing style, or what we know as the Hollywood style of editing, or the continuity style of editing. We've talked about the Americans. Now let us talk about what was happening in the other parts of the world. And here the Soviets have a very important contribution to make in the world of editing. We'll also talk about the other alternative views that came as a counter to the American style of editing, but let's start with the Soviets first. So around the same time as the Americans were doing their experimentations and had sort of developed, you know, their editing style, there were also a lot of experiments that were being conducted by the Russian filmmakers, and this was after the October Revolution of 1917. There was not a lot of availability of film stock there to be shooting new material. So what the Russian filmmakers did was, they started recutting already as existing material, and which was specifically the American films. So they recut the existing films and they did experiments with it. So a very famous experiment during that time that came into existence was the Kuleshov experiment, and this Kuleshov experiment actually became or formed the basis for the Soviet style of editing. Again, this is something that we will talk about in detail in the next chapter. So what the Soviets did and what they developed was that through thoughtful editing, it was possible to inspire ideas, and it was possible to invigorate audiences. So what they said, as opposed to what the Americans were doing, was that they believed that it was editing, it was how the two different shots were put together that actually was important, because that is what constructed meaning. So other Soviet filmmakers like Eisenstein and Pudovkin, they believed that film and editing could be very important propaganda rules, because through editing you could design a message, a very specific message to be communicated to the audience. Another very important person is Dziga Vertov, who in his 1929 film Man with a Movie Camera, he exhibited the huge possibilities that are available through editing. Man with the Movie Camera was basically a documentary, and what he did in the documentary was that he just took the camera along and shot different places of the city and put them together in a very interesting manner. So he again stressed on the possibility of the editing and how it is that the camera can capture, you know, anything and everything, that it can give you perspectives that are new to the people. A very interesting concept that he talked about was the kino eye. So kino eye literally translates to the eye of the camera. And what he said was that it's the kino eye, or the eye of the camera, that can actually very specifically choose to show something and not choose to show something. So which is why he stressed on the importance of the camera. Around the 1950s and 60s, there were the French filmmakers like Jean-Luc Godard, who through their editing style, they developed an editing style, and what they did was that they basically challenged the dominant form of American continuity filmmaking. So one of the important things or one of the important tools that they developed or that was used to challenge this particular style was the jump cut. Now jump cut, we have recently talked about jump cut with reference to George Méliès, but this jump cut is slightly different. Now what does a jump cut do? It introduces a temporal and a spatial discontinuity, and there is less emphasis on creating a smooth montage or on creating a story or on creating a narrative that is very easy flowing, that is continuous. A lot of other film movements also developed around the same time that focused less on the narrative style, the American narrative style, and focused more on telling the grim reality, or trying to tell what reality is. So there were the Italian neorealism. You also have, of course, the French New Wave and cinema verite. All of these movements, what they did was they countered the established Hollywood style of editing. So what it did was that they reinvented how film was edited. It was completely in opposition to what the Americans were doing. Now by the 1970s, a lot of the conventions that we relate to editing today were pretty much established. So whether it was the Hollywood style, you know, the continuous style, or whether it was the countermeasures or the alternate views to editing, by the 1970s there was this basically a good understanding of how editing, of what editing can do. Now let us now talk about the editing equipment and the changes that have happened over the years. Early on in the beginning, your editors were mostly women, right? Because editing was thought of as a very mechanical work, like something like sewing or knitting. The technique that was followed was the scissor and tape and the glue method. So basically you would just cut a film and glue it together. So it was a very linear process wherein you would have to move from point one, you know, you would have to start from the beginning of the film and then move on gradually till the end of the film. So this is what linear editing is known as. In 1924, a very important equipment came to the market, which was the vertical moviola. What this moviola did was that it allowed the editors to actually view the frame while editing. So up till now, the editors had to, you know, put the negative up, the film roll up, you know, against a light. But with the coming of the moviola, the editors could actually place, you know, better cuts than they were able to do with just the scissor and a glue system. In 1953, the first Steenbeck flat bed editor came into existence, which was the ST200. Now what it did was that it edited film with sound, and it allowed the editors to place very precise cuts. So these were various advancements that were taking place, you know, in the editing. Then came, of course, the digital age, the 1960s. It saw the beginning of computer based editing. Now what computer based editing did was that it gave the editors the freedom to edit the film in a non-linear fashion. So in 1829, Avid came up with this non-editing linear suite. So what it did was that you could edit the climax of the film first and then move on to the beginning. So this freedom to the editor was available through the coming of the digital non-linear editing suites. NLE, as it is known today, we all are familiar with it. What it did was that it became this quicker and less expensive method than the analog film editing style. So this has been a good history of how editing was introduced. So let's now just do a quick recap. Let's just do a quick summary of what all we have learned in the lesson today. So we started off by tracing the history of editing, right? We talked about the various precursors that have existed before editing came into cinema. So we talked about the editing, about the beginning of editing, and also its evolution through the years. We talked about the established norms and the alternate views on editing that were developed through this evolution, and we also touched upon the various technological advancements that have actually changed in how we edit films today. In the next lesson, we are going to do something very interesting. We are going to talk about two very important styles of editing that have actually shaped editing as we know it today. So these are the Hollywood style of editing and the Soviet montage. We'll talk in detail as to how they came into being and what were the various rules that were associated with them. And we'll also talk about the kind of impact that they had on the visual storytelling. So how was it that Hollywood style of editing affected storytelling and the Soviet montage style editing impacted storytelling. So I hope you have learned something interesting today. The history of editing is actually quite interesting, and we'll now see you in the next lesson, and I'll see you later. Bye.